The unexpected encounter. Vanessa Blake had always been aware of the power of appearances, how the smallest gesture, a look, a word, or a smile, could speak volumes. She was accustomed to being judged, both positively and negatively, based on how she presented herself. But that had never fazed her. She had learned early on that success didn't just come from talent or intellect, it came from mastering perception. Walking through the corridors of the terminal, Vanessa noticed the usual faces, people lost in their own worlds, glued to their phones, looking distracted and disconnected from the hustle and bustle around them. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floors, echoing through the terminal, but to her, it felt like a reminder of the road she had taken to get here. It had not been easy. There had been countless moments where she had been underestimated because of her race, her gender, or the way she dressed. Yet, despite those challenges, Vanessa had always emerged victorious. She had sharpened herself like a blade in the face of adversity. But even now, with everything she had accomplished, there was always that silent undertone of doubt from others. And it was that subtle, insidious form of discrimination that both motivated and exhausted her. When she finally arrived at the first-class boarding gate, her heart gave a slight thump of anticipation. This was her domain. She belonged here, no matter how many times the world tried to make her feel like an outsider. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent with the same poise she always carried. A faint smile played at the corner of her lips as the attendant scanned the ticket. "Thank you, Miss Blake. Enjoy your flight," the agent said, the professionalism in her voice enough to indicate that she saw Vanessa's presence as nothing out of the ordinary. Vanessa nodded and moved toward the jet bridge. As she stepped onto the plane, she was greeted with the usual warm smile and polite nods from the flight attendants, but the atmosphere suddenly shifted. Something was different. She walked to her assigned seat, 1A, near the front of the first-class cabin, and settled into her plush leather chair, ready to stretch out and relax. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself take a deep breath. This was the moment she had been waiting for, peace after a whirlwind of work. But as she settled in, something unusual happened. A flight attendant approached her, her eyes scanning the boarding pass as though she were unsure. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said, her voice polite yet laced with a peculiar coldness. "I believe you might be in the wrong seat." Vanessa's eyes opened, and she looked up at the attendant, trying to read her face. "No," she said slowly, "I believe this is my seat. I'm in 1A." The flight attendant glanced down at the ticket again, her brow furrowing. She didn't seem convinced. The silence hung between them for a moment as the attendant scanned the boarding pass for a second time. Vanessa could feel the tension rising, the discomfort in the air palpable. It was strange, a subtle feeling that she couldn't quite place. "I'll need to check with the crew," the attendant said, her voice almost apologetic, but there was a certain undertone in her tone that made Vanessa uneasy. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and watched as the attendant walked away, her footsteps a bit too hurried for someone simply doing their job. A few minutes passed. Vanessa's fingers lightly tapped against the armrest, her mind racing. It wasn't the first time she'd been questioned about her presence in spaces that were dominated by others. As a successful businesswoman, she had been in rooms where she was the only person of color, only woman, for that matter, yet her position had always been clear. Today was supposed to be about relaxing, about enjoying her success. She didn't want to deal with this. But the reality was, the fight for a seat at the table, quite literally and metaphorically, was a battle that never ended. The battle to prove her worth, not just in the boardroom but in places like this too, where people often assumed she didn't belong. She took another deep breath, steadying herself. A few moments later, the attendant returned, this time not alone. A senior flight attendant had joined her, a man whose uniform was neatly pressed and whose demeanor was stiff and formal. Vanessa didn't say anything at first. She just watched them approach, her eyes steady, her heart calm. "I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to move," the senior attendant said, his tone not even attempting to disguise the authority in his voice. Vanessa blinked. For a moment, she couldn't process what he was saying. Was he asking her to move from a seat that she had legally purchased? Was she being asked to leave because of her skin color, or was there something else she was missing? "I'm sorry, I don't understand," Vanessa said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is my seat. I paid for it in full." The senior flight attendant didn't blink. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer any explanation. "We have a policy that requires us to reserve this seat for a higher priority passenger," he said flatly. A higher priority passenger? Vanessa's mind raced. She knew that there were higher-tier passengers, the elite few who had access to a world she knew all too well. But she also knew that her ticket was fully paid, her status in the system had been confirmed long before she boarded. There was no mistake. This wasn't about her being in the wrong seat, it was about something much more insidious. "I don't think you understand," Vanessa said, keeping her voice even, but her words now sharp with the realization of what was happening. "This seat is mine. I'm not moving." The senior attendant's eyes flickered, and he looked toward the other flight attendant as if for confirmation. There was a brief silence, one that stretched on far too long for comfort. But Vanessa wasn't about to back down. She knew exactly how this was going to play out. It wasn't about arguing. It was about showing them that she wasn't going anywhere, and she would not be intimidated into relinquishing her place. Without saying another word, she stood up slowly, her back straight and shoulders squared. The flight attendants watched her, their faces betraying a sense of discomfort, but none of them spoke up. Vanessa gathered her things, her briefcase, her coat, and her purse. She moved as if she were completely unbothered, but inside, she could feel the weight of the injustice. She was being humiliated, but she refused to let them see it. She walked past the first-class passengers who had begun to stare. No one said a word. Their silence was deafening. But Vanessa didn't care. She moved toward the economy section, her eyes never wavering, her demeanor unbroken. She slipped into an empty seat in the middle row, far from the luxury of first class. The flight attendants continued with their duties, oblivious to the storm that had just begun to brew. But as Vanessa sat quietly in her new seat, she didn't feel defeated. She wasn't going to let this moment break her. In fact, she knew something the flight attendants didn't: she wasn't alone. And this wouldn't be the last time they would hear from her. What they didn't know was that her silent partner, a man who had been sitting a few rows behind her, had already set something into motion. A series of actions that would not only change the course of this flight but would also shake the very foundations of the airline industry itself. The power of silence. Vanessa sat in the economy section, the familiar hum of the airplane engines vibrating through her seat. She didn't look around, didn't engage with the people sitting near her. Instead, she stared out of the window, her mind calculating the moment. The flight attendants had resumed their work, the hum of their voices blending with the overhead announcements and the soft rustling of papers. No one had spoken to her after she moved. Not one person had uttered an apology. Yet the tension in the air had shifted. The moment of confrontation, the stifled silence, had left an indelible mark on the cabin. But Vanessa wasn't concerned with the passengers around her. She was too focused on what was happening just a few rows behind her. Nathaniel Cole. He hadn't said a word during the incident, hadn't stirred when she was questioned or when she calmly relocated. He had watched quietly, his eyes taking in every detail, as if he were already planning what came next. Nathaniel was a man who had been in the background of Vanessa's career for years. He wasn't the type to make noise, to draw attention to himself. In fact, he preferred the shadows, his influence reached far and wide, but he knew the value of subtlety. Nathaniel had known that a single silent action could speak louder than any loud protest. He also knew that sometimes, silence wasn't just about restraint. It was about power. Nathaniel had witnessed discrimination in all its forms before. He had watched it unfold in boardrooms, at gala dinners, and even at the highest levels of government. He had been on the receiving end of bias as well, though his had often come in the form of doubt about his unconventional rise to power. He didn't fit the mold of a typical corporate leader, and for years, that had made him a target. But now, his influence was undeniable. As the plane climbed higher, Nathaniel's fingers hovered over his phone, his mind running through his options. He had already started taking notes on the incident. It had been the same thing he'd seen countless times before, someone in a position of power abusing their authority, not realizing the scale of their mistake. But this time, the woman who had been humiliated wasn't just any passenger. She was Vanessa Blake, a force of nature who had earned her place in the world through sheer willpower and intelligence. She had shown restraint, the kind of calm that was both a blessing and a burden for women like her. They were expected to be calm, expected to take the high road when others crossed boundaries. And that was why Nathaniel knew that Vanessa, in her silence, had made a choice. She was no longer going to tolerate being a passive participant in her own humiliation. Nathaniel had the power to shift the scales. And he wasn't about to let this moment slip by unnoticed. Meanwhile, Vanessa was still processing what had happened. Her heart had begun to slow from the initial rush of anger, but the sharp sting of the humiliation still lingered. She wasn't angry at the flight attendants, not entirely. She understood their roles. They were just following orders. What really bothered her was the systemic nature of the injustice. The way she had been treated as though her presence was an anomaly, as though she didn't belong in first class, in a seat she had paid for. She knew how it worked. She had seen it too many times, whether it was the dismissive glance from a colleague or the patronizing tone from a superior. It was always the same, the unspoken bias that lingered in every interaction, the assumption that she didn't belong. And for a moment, Vanessa had considered standing up and confronting the attendants, demanding an explanation, forcing them to admit that their actions were unjust. But she knew better. There was no point in arguing with ignorance. Instead, she chose to act with grace and poise, a weapon far stronger than any words. She had moved, relocated, and showed them that she wouldn't stoop to their level. Her dignity was hers to preserve, and no one could take that from her. But she had also made a decision in that moment. This would not be the end of it. As the flight continued, Vanessa's thoughts raced, planning her next move. There was something bigger at play here, something far more significant than one flight incident. This was about a pattern, a larger, systemic issue that reached beyond this single moment. This wasn't just about her fight for justice. This was about making sure that no one else would have to experience the same kind of humiliation, no matter who they were or what they looked like. In the quiet of the airplane cabin, with the gentle hum of the engines lulling the passengers into a false sense of calm, Vanessa made a choice. She wasn't just going to let this go. She would take action. She would make the airline and the flight attendants realize that their actions had consequences. Her eyes flickered to the back of the plane where Nathaniel sat quietly. He had been watching her, and she knew that, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, he was just as committed to seeing justice done as she was. She had no idea how he planned to help her, but she trusted him. Across the cabin, Nathaniel had already made his move. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen of his phone, sending a message to his assistant, who was already on the other end, tracking the progress of the flight. Nathaniel's assistant was a part of his team that specialized in crisis management, public relations, and corporate affairs. She was already in touch with the airline's top executives, preparing for the inevitable backlash. By the time the flight landed, the airline would be under intense scrutiny. Nathaniel had made sure of that. As he set the phone down, he leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engine soothe him. He had worked in industries that thrived on power plays and behind-the-scenes maneuvering, and he knew that one of the most potent weapons in any battle wasn't the loudest voice, it was the quietest. Silence, when used strategically, could be devastating. And right now, the silence between him and Vanessa was the calm before the storm. The flight continued its journey, the hours slipping away as the plane cruised over the clouds. Nathaniel, still deep in thought, knew that what had transpired on this flight wasn't just a personal matter, it was a movement in the making. Vanessa had unwittingly become a symbol, and as her silent partner, he would ensure that her story would echo far beyond the confines of this flight. The wheels of change were already turning. And when the plane landed, nothing would be the same. The silent storm begins. The plane descended gradually, the hum of the engines shifting as it prepared for landing. Vanessa, who had been deep in thought for the past few hours, finally allowed herself to look around. The flight had been uneventful since the confrontation, a strange calm taking over the cabin after the unsettling incident. Passengers had kept to themselves, either too embarrassed or too apathetic to engage in any conversation about what had transpired. It seemed as though no one wanted to break the fragile silence that had descended on the flight. But Vanessa felt the weight of the silence in a way no one else could. For her, it was a powerful, calculated tool, something that could break an institution, bend the rules of power, and shift the course of a conversation. She glanced toward Nathaniel, who remained seated a few rows behind her. He hadn't moved since the moment she had relocated to economy, his expression unreadable. In his silence, Vanessa could sense the planning, the wheels of action already in motion. He wasn't just an observer, he was part of something bigger than either of them could fully comprehend just yet. His eyes met hers briefly, and in that exchange, she knew he understood what she was thinking. The next phase was already in motion, and there was no turning back. As the plane touched down on the runway, the usual rush of excitement and relief that came with landing didn't register with Vanessa. Instead, there was a quiet, tense anticipation as the flight attendants began their final preparations for disembarking. She could feel the pull of the outside world growing closer, but she wasn't ready to re-enter it just yet. The world outside didn't know what had just happened on board, but it would. She was certain of that. The plane came to a smooth halt, the wheels screeching gently as the brakes engaged. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and passengers began unbuckling their belts and gathering their belongings. Vanessa remained still, her hands resting on her lap. She knew what she had to do. It was time to confront the system, time to show the airline that their actions had consequences. She reached for her phone, where a single message from Nathaniel was waiting for her. "It's time. Let's get them to hear us. I'll be right behind you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that Vanessa felt in her bones. Nathaniel had never been one for empty promises or vague plans. His approach was always methodical and precise. He had a way of turning silence into a weapon, and right now, he was preparing the battleground for what was about to unfold. As the passengers disembarked, Vanessa stood slowly, not wanting to draw attention to herself. She waited until the majority of people had left the cabin, giving herself a moment to breathe and collect her thoughts. She was ready to take action, but she wasn't going to rush it. The moment had to be perfect. Once the aisle had cleared, Vanessa stood up and made her way to the front of the plane. She walked with the same composed confidence that had earned her respect in the business world. The flight attendants who had been involved in the confrontation were still standing near the front, chatting among themselves as if nothing had happened. But when they saw her approach, their faces fell, and the conversation stopped abruptly. "Excuse me," Vanessa said, her voice calm but firm. "I need to speak with someone in charge." The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances before one of them, the same attendant who had questioned her earlier, nodded and reached for the intercom. "Let me get the manager," she said, her voice quieter now, the tone laced with uncertainty. Vanessa didn't respond. She simply waited. Minutes later, a man in a sharp suit approached her, his expression professional but guarded. He looked to be in his mid-40s, his hair meticulously combed and his shoes polished to perfection. He exuded authority, but there was a nervous energy in his posture, as though he had been briefed about the situation before arriving. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm the flight manager, Thomas Richards," he said, extending a hand, though Vanessa didn't take it. She knew this moment was about more than just pleasantries. "Mr. Richards," she replied, her voice steady. "I believe we need to discuss something important." The flight manager glanced around, as though hoping the conversation would go unnoticed. "Of course, I'm happy to address any concerns you have. We strive for excellence in customer service and—" "I don't think you understand," Vanessa interrupted, her voice still calm but now carrying an edge. "What happened on this flight is not about customer service. It's about respect." The manager blinked, clearly taken aback by her directness. He opened his mouth to respond, but Vanessa continued before he could find his words. "I was told to move from my seat in first class," she said, her voice growing more resolute. "Despite the fact that I had a fully paid ticket. I was humiliated in front of other passengers, and no one said a word. They just watched in silence. That's what happened." The flight manager's face turned a shade paler. He had clearly not expected such a direct confrontation. I wasn't aware of the situation," he stammered. "I'm sure there's some misunderstanding. Let me look into this right away. Perhaps we can find a solution." "No," Vanessa said, shaking her head. "There's no misunderstanding. I'm not here to discuss the situation anymore. I'm here to let you know that what happened on this flight will not go unnoticed. Not by me, and certainly not by the public." The flight manager's eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to speak again, but Vanessa was already steps ahead of him. "I've already taken steps to ensure that your airline understands the consequences of this behavior," she said, her voice clear and cold. "The people involved will not get away with this." She turned to walk away, but stopped when she heard him speak again. "Please, let me help you resolve this. We can take care of it quietly. There's no need for—" "No," Vanessa replied, her voice firm and final. "This is bigger than you, Mr. Richards. This is about a pattern of behavior. This is about a system that needs to change. You'll be hearing from me, and you'll be hearing from a lot of people soon." With that, Vanessa walked away, her step steady and purposeful. The weight of her words lingered in the air, and she could see the flight manager standing frozen in place, his mind racing. As she exited the plane, she caught sight of Nathaniel standing in the terminal just beyond the jetway. His gaze met hers, and he offered her a small but knowing smile. She didn't need words. He had done his part, and now it was time for the world to hear their story. But what they didn't know yet, what no one could have predicted, was the chain of events they had set into motion. The ripple effect was about to explode across the airline industry, and the quiet power of their actions was going to shake the very foundations of the business world. The ripple effect. As the minutes passed and Vanessa Blake made her way through the terminal, the weight of what had transpired began to settle in. She could feel the energy in her chest, quiet, but powerful. Her silence, her grace under pressure, had already spoken volumes, and she knew that this was just the beginning. Nathaniel was close behind her, his presence a calm shadow. He moved with the kind of precision that came from years of knowing exactly what was needed, when, and how. He hadn't said a word since they'd left the plane, but Vanessa didn't need him to speak. She could feel the gravity of what they had set in motion. The flight incident was already more than just a personal slight. It was no longer just about her, a businesswoman fighting for her dignity on a first-class flight. It was about something far larger, a systematic issue that had always lingered just beneath the surface, an issue that needed to be brought into the light. And Vanessa was determined to be the one to do it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She retrieved it, glancing at the message from Nathaniel. You made the right move. I've already alerted the media. They'll be ready when we're done. Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't anticipated the speed with which Nathaniel would act, but now that she knew, she couldn't help but feel a surge of confidence. The media would pick up the story, yes, but they wouldn't be the only ones. There was something bigger at stake here, something that would make this story reverberate throughout the entire corporate world. Nathaniel had told her that her silence, her restraint, would become the ultimate weapon. It was starting to make sense to her now. People had always underestimated her for the way she carried herself, the calm, composed manner that had often been mistaken for weakness. But now, she saw it for what it truly was, power. And with Nathaniel's quiet brilliance guiding her, that power was about to explode. As the two of them moved through the busy airport, their steps quickening, Vanessa couldn't shake the thought of what was next. What would happen when the media got wind of the story? The flight crew might not have known it at the time, but they had just sparked a wave of change. Vanessa's quiet dignity had just given rise to an undeniable truth: the system was flawed, and it would be held accountable. As she and Nathaniel exited the terminal and approached a waiting black SUV, Vanessa caught a glimpse of her reflection in the glass doors. She looked tired, but there was an undeniable fire behind her eyes. She had been tested, humiliated in public, and yet she had stood firm. Now she was ready to make her voice heard, ready to ensure that no one would ever face the kind of treatment she had experienced. The driver opened the door, and Vanessa slid into the back seat, followed by Nathaniel. As the car pulled away from the curb, the city skyline loomed ahead, but her mind was already far beyond the towering buildings and flashing lights. She had a plan. The stakes were high, but she was ready to rise to the challenge. Nathaniel's voice broke the silence in the car. They won't know what hit them, he said, his tone calm but confident. Vanessa didn't look at him. She simply nodded, her gaze focused ahead. They'll be forced to listen, she replied, her voice low but unwavering. This won't be a small ripple, Nathaniel. This will be a storm. It didn't take long for the first wave of media coverage to hit. Within hours of the plane landing, reports began circulating on social media. At first, it was just one or two posts, but it didn't take long for the story to gain traction. The hashtag respect in the sky trended, and people began to share their own stories of discrimination or mistreatment at the hands of airline staff. But what truly set this incident apart was Vanessa's quiet power. Unlike other viral incidents, where the subject lashed out or sought to make a spectacle of themselves, Vanessa's response had been calm, controlled, and dignified. She hadn't demanded a public apology. She hadn't shouted from the rooftops. She had let the story speak for itself, letting her actions do the talking. The press conferences, the interviews, the carefully crafted statements all followed in rapid succession. As the world began to turn its attention to the events aboard that flight, the airline's higher-ups scrambled. They had tried to sweep the incident under the rug, but the media wasn't having it. Vanessa's message was clear. She wasn't going to let this go, and neither was anyone else who had been subjected to unfair treatment, in the skies or on the ground. Inside the airline's corporate offices, executives sat around a long conference table, the room thick with tension. They had anticipated a media storm, but nothing of this magnitude. The story was no longer about a single passenger being mistreated. It was about a systemic problem that had affected countless people, especially people of color, for years. "This is a mess," one of the executives said, rubbing his temples. "How did this escalate so quickly?" "It's not just about what happened on the plane," another executive replied. "It's the fact that Vanessa Blake has leverage. She's well known in her industry, and she has allies. If we don't fix this, it's not just going to be a PR issue. It'll affect our bottom line." As the executives scrambled to figure out how to contain the situation, Nathaniel had already put his plan into motion. In a matter of hours, a lawsuit was filed on behalf of Vanessa Blake, not just against the airline for the mistreatment, but also for negligence and the broader issue of discriminatory practices within the airline industry. Nathaniel's team had already secured statements from dozens of passengers who had witnessed the incident, many of whom were now rallying behind Vanessa. They spoke to reporters, sharing their observations, and amplifying the injustice that had occurred. The movement was no longer just about one woman's experience, it had become a full-blown campaign for change. The hashtag Respect in the Sky continued to trend, and as the days passed, the airline found itself at the center of an ever-growing public relations nightmare. There was no way out, no simple apology that could erase the damage that had been done. But for Vanessa, this wasn't about a quick fix. This wasn't about her getting a simple apology or financial compensation. No, she wanted more. She wanted systemic change. She wanted to be sure that the world knew exactly what had happened, that people understood how ingrained these biases were, and how they affected everyday lives. The battle was far from over. This was just the beginning. But as Vanessa stood in front of the cameras for the first time, the weight of everything they had set into motion heavy on her shoulders, she knew one thing for sure: she had the world's attention. And now, it was time to turn that attention into action. The power of visibility. The days following the media frenzy were a blur for Vanessa Blake. What had started as a quiet act of resistance had quickly morphed into a movement that captured the attention of millions. It wasn't just about the treatment she had endured on that flight anymore. It had become about the power of standing firm in the face of systemic injustice. The ripple effect of her silence had turned into a tidal wave that was washing over every corner of the airline industry, exposing the flaws that had long been hidden beneath the polished surface. In the whirlwind of interviews, press releases, and constant media attention, Vanessa found herself in front of the cameras more than she had ever anticipated. At first, the experience felt surreal. She had spent her career working in boardrooms, securing multi-million-dollar deals, and navigating the complexities of corporate life. Public speaking had always been part of her skill set, but this was different. This wasn't a deal negotiation or a corporate presentation. This was a fight for justice, an unexpected battle that had thrust her into the spotlight. Nathaniel had been her unwavering support through it all, quietly working behind the scenes to ensure that every step she took was deliberate, strategic, and calculated. Together, they had crafted a narrative that didn't just highlight her mistreatment, it painted a larger picture of how such incidents were symptomatic of a much deeper problem. Each media appearance Vanessa made, each post she shared, was a deliberate move. She knew how powerful her voice was, and she wasn't going to let it be silenced. Yet, through it all, she still remained calm, poised, the essence of quiet power that had defined her entire journey. Her every word was measured, every expression controlled. But behind that serene exterior was a fire, a burning need to make sure that this wasn't just about one incident but a reckoning for an entire industry that had long operated without accountability. The morning of her most important press conference arrived, and with it, a sense of finality. This was it, the day she would take control of the narrative completely. The day she would announce to the world that this wasn't just about a single flight. This was about the pervasive issue of racial bias in the airline industry, and the world needed to take notice. Nathaniel had been in constant communication with media outlets, legal teams, and advocacy groups. The lawsuit had gained traction faster than they had anticipated, and Vanessa was now an official figurehead for an entire movement. It was no longer just about seeking justice for herself, it was about ensuring that the voices of countless others who had been silenced were finally heard. As Vanessa arrived at the conference, she was greeted by the flash of cameras and the buzz of reporters whispering to each other. There was a palpable energy in the air, a mix of anticipation and nervous tension. Vanessa stood tall, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She had been through this before, facing scrutiny, navigating tough situations, speaking with conviction. But today was different. Today, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every passenger who had ever felt marginalized, every person who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. The press conference began, and Vanessa was immediately bombarded with questions. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she took her seat at the podium, cleared her throat, and began speaking with a calm authority that filled the room. Thank you all for being here today. What began as a simple act of disrespect has turned into something much bigger, something that I never could have imagined when I first boarded that flight, she began, her voice steady and clear. The airline industry, like many other industries, has long been allowed to operate under the illusion of fairness and equality. But the truth is, bias is baked into the system. It is not something that can be ignored, swept under the rug, or dismissed with a shallow apology. It is something that needs to be addressed head-on. And that is why I am standing here today. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. She could see the reporters leaning forward, their pens poised, the silence hanging heavy in the air. People are often quick to say that this is an isolated incident. That I was simply a victim of one person's ignorance. But I'm here to tell you that this is far from an isolated incident. I have spoken to countless people, black men and women, people of color, people from every walk of life, who have experienced similar treatment. Who have been made to feel invisible, unheard, unimportant. And it needs to stop. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the passion behind her words more palpable now. Vanessa had spent her life mastering the art of self-control, of never letting her emotions cloud her judgment. But today, her emotions were not her enemy. They were her strength. The actions of the flight attendants were not just an isolated error. They reflect a larger culture of systemic inequality that runs deep within this industry, Vanessa continued. And it's time we hold the airline industry, and all industries accountable for their actions. No longer will we allow this culture of disrespect to go unchallenged. She took a deep breath, her heart racing, but her mind clear. This is not about one airline. This is about changing an entire system. This is about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, has the right to exist in spaces without being made to feel less than. I will not stand by while this continues to happen. The room was still. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. The reporters, who had been ready to pounce on the first sign of weakness or hesitation, were now silent. They understood the significance of what Vanessa had just said. Vanessa knew that this press conference was not the end. It was just another step in a much longer journey. But it was an important one. The story was no longer just hers. It belonged to every single person who had ever been ignored, disrespected, or dismissed because of who they were. And together, they were about to change everything. As the press conference concluded, Vanessa made her way out of the room, her steps deliberate, her mind already turning to the next phase. She knew the media would continue to cover the story. She knew the legal battle was far from over. But more importantly, she knew that she had sparked something that would not be easily extinguished. Nathaniel was waiting for her just outside the doors, a small but approving smile on his face. He had been watching, listening, calculating the entire time. "You did it," he said simply, his voice low but full of admiration. Vanessa looked at him, her expression serious but satisfied. "We're just getting started." The winds of change. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity, but for Vanessa Blake, they were also a period of reflection. As the world rallied around her message of systemic change, as the airline industry scrambled to repair its image, she found herself with a growing sense of purpose, one that was no longer just about an individual fight for respect, but about something far more transformative. The press coverage continued to grow, but it wasn't just news outlets that were taking notice. Public opinion was shifting. Social media, which had once served as a platform for complaints and personal grievances, had now become a battleground for change. Hashtags like hashtag respect in the sky and hashtag change in the air were trending worldwide, and every day brought new stories from people who had witnessed or experienced similar treatment on flights. It was clear that Vanessa's story had ignited something much larger than herself, a movement that was reaching far beyond the confines of the airline industry. As the media spotlight focused on Vanessa, she found herself increasingly called upon to speak at conferences, participate in panel discussions, and even appear on talk shows. But what was most striking about her newfound role as a public figure wasn't the attention, it was the deep sense of responsibility that she now carried. She had never expected to become the face of a movement, but in many ways, she had become its heartbeat. And with that came the weight of ensuring that this moment wasn't fleeting, that it wouldn't fade into obscurity like so many others before it. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of interviews and meetings, Vanessa sat alone in her penthouse apartment overlooking the city. The glow of the skyline stretched out before her, the lights shimmering like stars in the night. She didn't feel exhausted, she felt energized. This fight, this mission, had become more than a series of events for her. It had become a purpose. She had known, deep down, that the world needed to change. But now, she could feel it. She could feel the momentum building. People were listening. And change was inevitable. She was pulled from her thoughts by the soft ping of a message on her phone. It was from Nathaniel. The airline is ready to negotiate. Vanessa set the phone down, her mind racing. The moment she had known would come was finally here. Negotiations. This was the turning point. The airline, realizing the magnitude of the situation, had reached out. But Vanessa knew this wasn't going to be just about settling the matter quietly. No, it was time for accountability, real accountability, and she wasn't about to let them sweep this under the rug. Not now, not after everything that had happened. She typed a quick response. Set the meeting. Let's make them listen. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and final preparations. Nathaniel was meticulously orchestrating the strategy, ensuring that every angle was covered. Vanessa was prepared. She had already decided that this meeting would not be about negotiating a settlement or seeking monetary compensation. This was about making sure that this wasn't an isolated incident, that it was part of a broader conversation. She had a list of demands, none of which were unreasonable, but all of which would make a difference for future passengers, for people like her, for people who had been unseen for too long. The day of the meeting arrived, and Vanessa, dressed in her usual impeccable style, walked into the sleek conference room at the airline's headquarters. Her heels clicked on the marble floor as she approached the long table where the airline's executives were seated. There was a tense air about the room, the kind that only comes when people know they've been caught. She took a seat at the head of the table, her posture straight and commanding, her gaze steady as she surveyed the room. Nathaniel stood behind her, his presence a quiet but formidable force. Vanessa's eyes met the CEO's, a man who had likely never been challenged in such a direct way in his career. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but his attempt at maintaining composure was no match for Vanessa's unwavering resolve. "Thank you for meeting with me today," Vanessa began, her voice calm, yet firm. "I trust you are aware of the situation at hand. What happened on that flight was not a simple mistake. It was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a systemic issue within your company, and within the airline industry at large." The CEO cleared his throat, glancing at his colleagues, trying to gauge the situation, perhaps unsure of how to proceed. "Yes, Ms. Blake, we understand the gravity of the situation. We want to make things right." Vanessa smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Making things right is more than just issuing an apology or writing a check. It's about changing the culture. It's about acknowledging that there is an ongoing issue within this industry and committing to fix it, for good. Nathaniel spoke up then, his voice steady and confident. We've already outlined the key areas that need immediate attention. We're not here to negotiate small concessions. What we're here to do is push for systemic change, changes that will ensure that no one ever has to go through what Vanessa did. No one should have to fight for their dignity on a flight because of the color of their skin. The room grew heavier as the reality of their situation settled in. The airline executives had been hoping for a quick fix, a way to minimize the damage and move on. But Vanessa wasn't interested in a quick fix. She was interested in long-term change. "We have a proposal," Nathaniel continued, sliding a folder across the table. "We expect the following: 1. Immediate policy changes regarding racial bias training for all flight attendants and staff. 2. A public apology, not just to Ms. Blake, but to every passenger who has experienced similar treatment. 3. A commitment to diversity and inclusion in hiring and leadership roles. And 4. An establishment of a new accountability mechanism, with regular reports to the public about progress made." Vanessa added, "And let me be clear, this isn't negotiable. We expect full implementation, and we will hold you accountable if you don't follow through." There was silence in the room, a charged moment where the executives could feel the weight of their next move. This wasn't about avoiding a lawsuit or paying a settlement, it was about answering to a growing movement that would no longer be silenced. The CEO sat back, looking defeated, but he knew they had no choice but to comply. The pressure from the media, the public, and now, the influential figures in the room made it impossible for them to ignore the truth any longer. "We'll work on implementing these changes," the CEO finally said, his voice low, resigned. Vanessa nodded, but her mind was already on the next step. She knew this was a victory, but it was just one step in a much larger battle. She had started something that couldn't be undone, and now, with the airline's commitment to change, she would make sure that every other company in the industry knew that they, too, would be held accountable. As she left the conference room, her heart felt lighter, but her resolve was unshakable. This was just the beginning of a larger movement, one that would redefine not just the airline industry, but the way the world viewed equality and fairness. She had planted the seeds, and now it was time to watch them grow.